The year was 1907, and America was staring into the abyss. Businesses were collapsing, banks were failing, and the entire economy seemed moments away from total ruin. Fear gripped the nation, and no one seemed to have the answers. And then, from an unexpected corner came a solution, not from a president or a politician, but from a man whose name echoed through the halls of finance, John Pierpont Morgan. Known simply as J.P. Morgan, this banker wasn't just rich, he was powerful enough to step in when the government couldn't. Morgan's bold moves didn't just stabilize the economy, they reshaped how America viewed finance forever. Twice, he pulled the nation back from the edge of disaster. This is the incredible story of J.P. Morgan, the banker who saved America. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more amazing stories like this one. Now let's get started. Here's the story. To many, J.P. Morgan was hailed as a hero, a man who stepped in to save capitalism from the brink of collapse. But to others, he was the face of greed and monopolistic control. Over the years, the constant criticism and unrelenting public scrutiny began to take a toll on him. By the end of his life, Morgan was no longer the towering figure he had once been. He was frail, isolated, and struggling mentally. To truly understand the misery of his final days, though, we need to take a step back and look at how it all began. Unlike many great financial titans who rose from humble beginnings, J.P. Morgan's story was very different. He was born into immense privilege in 1837, a world of opportunity that few could even imagine. His family was already deeply entrenched in elite American society. His maternal ancestor, James Pierpont, co-founded Yale University, a legacy that speaks volumes about the family's influence. His grandfather played a major role in establishing the Aetna Insurance Company, while his father, Junius Spencer Morgan, was a powerhouse in his own right. Junius transitioned from running a Hartford dry goods company to becoming a partner in a prominent London-based merchant banking firm. With such connections, it's no surprise that when young J.P. Morgan came of age, his path was already laid out for him. In 1856, he took his first steps into the world of finance, starting his career in his father's London branch. It was a position most could only dream of, and it gave him the perfect launchpad to build his empire. But as we dive deeper, we'll uncover how this man, born into privilege and rising to immense power, ultimately became both a savior and a symbol of corruption, before his story took a dark and lonely turn. Let's take a closer look at what made J.P. Morgan so successful. His journey into finance began with his father's powerful banking connections. By 1857, just a year after entering the industry, he moved to New York to work at Duncan, Sherman & Company, a firm closely tied to George Peabody & Company, one of the most influential merchant banking firms of the era. It was here that Morgan gained invaluable experience and access to a network of powerful financiers and industrialists. These connections would shape his career and solidify his future in finance. In 1860, Morgan launched J.P. Morgan & Company, where he served as his father's agent in New York. Over the next few years, he steadily expanded his influence and refined his financial skills. While his career was flourishing, the Civil War broke out. Like many wealthy men of his time, Morgan avoided military service by legally paying for a substitute soldier. But what happened next showcased both his cunning and his controversial side. Morgan saw a lucrative opportunity during the war. He began supplying materials to the Union Army, making significant profits. However, this venture wasn't without its scandals. One infamous deal involved the sale of defective rifles to the Union Army. When the rifles backfired on soldiers, Morgan faced investigations. Yet, thanks to his skilled lawyers, he was cleared of wrongdoing. They argued he had no prior knowledge of the gun's poor condition. The case was closed, and Morgan walked away unscathed. These early moves in his career reveal a man who wasn't just privileged, he was strategic and resourceful. Morgan knew how to turn opportunities into success and how to navigate crises to protect his growing empire. It was a pattern that would define his rise to becoming one of the most powerful figures in American finance. In 1865, with the Civil War finally over, the United States was entering a period of rapid industrialization. The country was booming, and businesses were thriving in ways never seen before. For J.P. Morgan, this was the perfect storm. a chance to take advantage of the unprecedented economic growth and cement his position as a financial powerhouse. Morgan's connections to George Peabody and Company in London played a key role during this time. Through these ties, he gained access to an elite circle of British financiers, and Morgan didn't hesitate to use these connections. With foreign investment pouring into the rapidly expanding U.S. economy, Morgan positioned himself as the ideal middleman. His ability to secure British capital for American ventures set him apart. This strategy led him to partner with a prominent New York firm, Drexel, Morgan and Company, in 1871. The partnership with Drexel was transformative. It boosted Morgan's reputation while also turning the firm into a major player in financing critical U.S. infrastructure projects. One of the most significant industries of the time was railroads. Morgan wasted no time diving into this sector. While it might not seem obvious how railroads connected to finance, for Morgan, they represented an untapped goldmine. In 1869, Morgan took control of a large railroad operation. At the time, government financing for railroads was controlled by a handful of entities. Morgan saw an opportunity to break this monopoly. He led a syndicate that opened up railroad financing to new players, allowing him to gain greater influence in the industry. His strategy was simple yet effective: reorganize failing railroads and turn them into efficient, profitable operations. This approach, known as Morganization, became Morgan's signature move. Morgan didn't just fix struggling railroads, he transformed them. His vision was to create an integrated transportation network that would connect the entire country. By consolidating smaller, inefficient railroads into larger systems, he streamlined operations and increased profitability. His work had such a profound impact that nearly 1/6 of America's rail lines eventually came under his control. But Morgan wasn't just about profits. He was a strategist who could see problems before they became crises. The American railroad industry was notoriously chaotic in its early days, with cutthroat competition and no real regulations. Congress eventually stepped in with the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 to impose some order. Yet Morgan was always one step ahead. He organized meetings and conferences with railroad executives to bring stability to the industry. By brokering agreements on standardized rates and fostering cooperation among competitors, Morgan turned potential chaos into a system of order and reaped enormous financial rewards for his firm. Morgan's dominance in railroads was unmatched, but he wasn't satisfied. By the late 19th century, he had even bigger plans. His next target? The booming electricity industry. In 1891, Morgan pulled off one of his most ambitious moves yet. He orchestrated the merger of Edison General Electric and Thomson Houston Electric Company, creating General Electric, what we know today as GE. This new company became the leading manufacturer of electrical equipment in the U.S., solidifying Morgan's influence in yet another critical sector of the economy. However, Morgan's foray into electricity brought him into conflict with another industrial titan, John D. Rockefeller. At the time, Rockefeller dominated the oil industry through his company, Standard Oil. With electricity emerging as a potential competitor to oil as an energy source, tensions between the two giants were inevitable. What followed was a battle for control over America's future, as both men sought to expand their empires and secure their legacies. Morgan's ability to adapt and strategize made him a dominant figure in both the railroad and electricity industries. He wasn't just a financier. He was a visionary who understood how to reshape entire industries to serve his goals. And yet, his story was far from over. The rivalry with Rockefeller was just beginning, and Morgan's ambitions for control over the U.S. economy would push him into even more daring ventures. Let me take you back to a time when two giants clashed over the future of energy in America. On one side, there was John D. Rockefeller, whose company, Standard Oil, thrived on kerosene. Kerosene was the lifeblood of America's oil lamps, and Rockefeller's empire depended on it. But when electricity began to rise as a cleaner, more efficient alternative for lighting, Rockefeller saw the writing on the wall. This new era, led by J.P. Morgan and his electrification push, threatened to topple Rockefeller's dominance. Desperate to protect his empire, Rockefeller launched a fierce smear campaign against electricity. He planted stories in the press, warning people about its supposed dangers, fires, electrocutions, and anything else that might scare the public. But no amount of propaganda could stop the tide. The benefits of electricity were too obvious. Homes and businesses across the country quickly adopted it, signaling the dawn of a new era. Morgan's vision triumphed, solidifying his role as a key architect of the energy future in America. But Morgan wasn't content with just electricity or railroads. His ambitions stretched further. By the early 1900s, he set his sights on another industry: steel. For years, Morgan had been watching the steel industry grow, knowing it was the backbone of industrial America. Following his father's death, Morgan took full control of the family's financial empire and began crafting a plan to dominate steel. His goal wasn't small. He wanted nothing less than complete consolidation. In 1900, Morgan started negotiations with Charles M. Schwab, the president of Carnegie Steel, and directly engaged with Andrew Carnegie himself. Carnegie, a legendary industrialist, owned the largest steel company in the world. Morgan's goal was to buy Carnegie's business, along with several other steel and iron companies, and combine them into one giant corporation. After intense discussions, Carnegie agreed to sell his company to Morgan for $480 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $17 billion today. To put that into perspective, at the time, the deal represented nearly 3% of the entire U.S. GDP. What's even more astonishing is how the deal went down. There were no lawyers, no formal contracts, just a simple handshake between Morgan and Carnegie. This deal gave birth to the United States Steel Corporation, the world's first billion-dollar corporation, with an authorized capitalization of $1.4 billion. U.S. Steel didn't just dominate the production of steel. It controlled the construction of bridges, ships, railroads, cars, rails, and countless other products like nails and wire. At its peak, the company commanded 2/3 of the steel market, and it wasn't long before its market share climbed to 75%. Morgan had successfully created a steel empire, and his influence in the industry was unmatched. By the turn of the century, J.P. Morgan wasn't just a financier. He was a force of nature in the American economy. His banking house was one of the most powerful in the world, driving massive deals and reorganizations across industries. He extended his reach far beyond steel, gaining control over manufacturing, mining, shipping, communications, and even insurance companies. His influence stretched into nearly every corner of American business. Think about it for a moment. Morgan wasn't just shaping one industry, he was molding the entire economy. From the steel in America's bridges to the electricity powering its cities, Morgan's hand was in it all. His ambition, strategy, and ability to dominate industries made him one of the most powerful men of his time, and his story was far from over. It's hard to imagine one person holding so much power, right? Yet by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, J.P. Morgan had become one of the most influential figures in American history. His ability to rally resources, lead negotiations, and command entire industries made him indispensable, especially in times of crisis. But this extraordinary power wasn't without controversy, and the story of his rise is filled with both triumph and criticism. Let's start in 1895, when the United States was in deep financial trouble. The country faced a massive economic crisis that threatened the gold standard, the foundation of the nation's monetary system. Without a central bank to step in, it was Morgan who took charge. Leading a banking syndicate, he loaned the federal government $60 million in gold, equivalent to over $2.2 billion today. This bold and unprecedented move stabilized the economy and restored confidence in the U.S. monetary system. In essence, J.P. Morgan had saved the country from financial collapse. But that wasn't the last time he stepped in. Fast forward to 1907, and the nation was once again on the brink of disaster. A major financial panic had gripped the markets, with banks and financial institutions on the verge of collapse. Once again, all eyes turned to Morgan. He summoned the country's top financiers to his home in New York City and personally led tense, late-night negotiations. After days of talks, Morgan managed to convince these powerful players to pool their resources and bail out the failing institutions. This act single-handedly prevented a complete economic meltdown. For the second time in his life, J.P. Morgan had rescued the U.S. economy. By the early 1900s, Morgan had reached the peak of his power. His firm, along with its partners, controlled assets worth an astonishing $1.3 billion in 1907, over $48 billion today. His influence was unmatched, and his stature was almost godlike in the world of finance. Yet, with such concentrated power came growing scrutiny. As Morgan's dominance grew, so did the number of his critics. People began questioning whether one man or one firm should wield so much control over the economy. Many feared that his immense power was stifling free competition. Progressive politicians, investigative journalists, and even ordinary citizens accused Morgan of manipulating the financial system to benefit himself and his allies. The man who had twice saved the economy was now being portrayed as a villain, the symbol of unchecked capitalism. The turning point came in 1912, when Morgan was summoned to testify before a congressional committee investigating the money trust. This committee was tasked with uncovering whether a group of elite Wall Street financiers, including Morgan, had colluded to control the American banking system. The hearings were explosive, with Morgan himself cast as the face of excessive wealth and power. His critics accused him of using his influence to manipulate markets and suppress competition, putting his own interests ahead of the public's. These hearings marked a significant moment in Morgan's career and in the history of American capitalism. They didn't just shine a spotlight on Morgan's dominance. They also fueled a national conversation about the dangers of concentrated economic power. The public's growing distrust of Morgan and other powerful financiers laid the groundwork for greater regulation of banks and industries in the years that followed. Despite his immense contributions to the American economy, J.P. Morgan became a deeply polarizing figure. To some, he remained a hero who had twice saved the nation from financial ruin. But to others, he was the embodiment of greed, a man whose unchecked power threatened the very foundations of democracy. This complex legacy, of both brilliance and controversy, continues to define his place in history. The final chapter of J.P. Morgan's life marked the end of an era, not just for the man, but for the financial empire he built. By this time, Morgan had stepped back from actively managing his businesses. However, retirement was anything but peaceful for him. Instead of enjoying his later years, he faced mounting pressure and relentless scrutiny that weighed heavily on his mind and health. One major blow came during the congressional hearings into the money trust. Though Morgan had held his ground, the process left him shaken. The accusations of excessive control over the financial system and his role in dominating the economy deeply unsettled him. The stress of these events took a toll, triggering a mental breakdown. Plagued by anxiety and paranoia, Morgan began to lose his grip on reality. He was haunted by delusions, including the bizarre fear that Egyptians were plotting to assassinate him. His mental and physical health declined rapidly, and in 1913, just a year after the hearings, J.P. Morgan passed away. Morgan left behind a vast empire, but his death marked a turning point. His son, J.P. Morgan Jr., inherited the legacy, but he lacked the sharp instincts and innovative vision of his father. The sweeping financial reforms of the 1930s, brought on by the Great Depression, further dismantled the empire. The Glass-Steagall Act of 1933 forced the breakup of Morgan's powerful financial institution into three separate entities: J.P. Morgan and Company, Morgan Stanley, and Morgan Grenfell. Today, two of these still exist: J.P. Morgan Chase, with a staggering market capitalization of over $700 billion, and Morgan Stanley, valued at about $27 billion. While no one from the Morgan family remains a dominant figure in global finance, J.P. Morgan's legacy continues to shape the financial world. His impact on modern finance and the American economy is impossible to ignore. He was instrumental in funding railroads, steel mills, and industrial giants that powered the country's rapid growth during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His contributions laid the groundwork for the United States to emerge as an industrial superpower. Beyond his investments, Morgan revolutionized the financial sector itself. He introduced innovative practices that are now standard in modern investment banking. He pioneered techniques like underwriting securities and facilitating major mergers and acquisitions. Morgan's ability to create syndicates, financial groups that pooled resources from banks and investors, allowed him to fund projects on an unprecedented scale. Before Morgan's time, individual banks simply couldn't support massive ventures. Thanks to his leadership, it became possible to finance large-scale infrastructure and industrial projects that transformed the nation. Morgan's work didn't just shape businesses, it reshaped the entire U.S. financial system. During an era when the economy was fragmented and regional, his practices drove consolidation, efficiency, and growth. Many of the financial strategies and tools he introduced remain integral to corporate finance today. His legacy isn't just in the wealth he accumulated, but in the systems he created, systems that continue to support economies around the world. By the time of his death, the House of Morgan had reached its zenith under his leadership. Yet his passing marked the start of its decline. Over a century later, J.P. Morgan's name still carries immense weight, but the family's influence has faded. Even so, the financial institutions he founded remain global powerhouses, and his innovations live on in the practices that define modern banking. J.P. Morgan wasn't just a man of wealth. He was a visionary who built a financial empire that transformed America's economy and set the foundation for the corporate world we know today. Merchant banking in the early days was simple, small, and personal. It focused on regional investments and operated on relationships. But when J.P. Morgan stepped in, the entire landscape of banking changed forever. What was once a modest, localized industry transformed into a system of massive corporate banks driving national and global financial operations. This shift wasn't just about size, it redefined how banking worked. Morgan wasn't content with the old ways of doing things. He brought discipline and precision to corporate finance, changing how businesses were evaluated before investments were made. His firm pioneered the practice of digging deep into a company's finances, checking its records, evaluating its leadership, and analyzing its potential. This practice of financial due diligence, which is standard today in venture capital and investment banking, started with Morgan's insistence on making smart, informed decisions. His legacy is felt every time an investor does their homework before putting money on the line. But perhaps Morgan's most revolutionary contribution was the concept of Morganization. This approach went beyond lending money. Morgan and his team didn't just provide financing. They actively managed and restructured the companies they invested in. They joined company boards, influenced strategies, and reshaped operations. Morganization wasn't just about saving failing companies. It was about making them stronger and more efficient. This hands-on approach turned bankers into major players in America's industrial development. Today, practices like corporate restructuring, downsizing, and streamlining can all trace their roots back to Morgan's methods. Morgan's influence didn't stop there. He played a critical role in shaping modern corporate finance and driving America's industrial growth. His interventions and innovations helped Wall Street rise to global dominance. Without Morgan, it's hard to imagine the United States achieving the same level of industrial and economic power it holds today. His impact can be seen in everything from the way businesses raise capital to how industries are consolidated and managed. Yet, Morgan remains a deeply divisive figure. He was born into privilege, and he used his advantages to build even more wealth and power, sometimes at great cost to others. His legacy is a mix of brilliance and controversy. On one side, he brought growth, innovation, and advancement. On the other, he raised questions about ethical responsibility, monopolistic control, and the concentration of power in a few hands. His story forces us to ask difficult questions. How much power is too much? Should there be limits to what one person or institution can control? And what is the cost of progress when it comes at the expense of fairness? To some, Morgan was a hero who transformed America's economy. To others, he was a symbol of greed and unchecked ambition. What's undeniable is this: J.P. Morgan changed the game. His practices reshaped banking and corporate finance, and his influence still echoes through today's financial systems. Love him or hate him, his legacy is impossible to ignore. J.P. Morgan was a towering figure, a man who reshaped banking, stabilized economies, and left an indelible mark on modern finance. To some, he was a genius who brought order to chaos and built the backbone of America's industrial age. To others, he was the face of unchecked power, a man who manipulated markets and controlled industries to serve his own ambitions. His legacy is as controversial as it is monumental, a reflection of both brilliance and ruthlessness. But what do you think? Was Morgan a hero who fueled progress, or a monopolist who pushed boundaries too far? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories like this. The past is full of figures like Morgan, complex, flawed, and undeniably fascinating. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.